move on to myth number 3, which is that the Bank of Canada didn't print money. The Bank of Canada recently tweeted out that it did not print money during the pandemic to fund the government's COVID-19 spending. So I reached out to Franco Terrazzano, who's the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation with a background in economics, to ask him a few questions. Franco, the government spent over $600 billion in fiscal year 2020 to 2021, but it brought in less than $300 billion in revenues and ran a $354.2 billion deficit as a result. So how did the government finance this deficit?
Well, governments can raise revenue by taxes or by selling bonds to financial institutions, but the Bank of Canada can also buy Government of Canada bonds. And what was so different about the pandemic is that you saw the Bank of Canada's bond purchasing on overdrive. So the Bank of Canada's balance sheet increased by more than $300 billion during the pandemic, largely by buying Government of Canada debt. Now, at the heart of the pandemic, we saw the Bank of Canada's assets grow by about 300%. Now, that growth in the Bank of Canada's assets during the pandemic is larger than the growth that we saw in the recession of the 70s, of the 80s, of the 90s, and even larger than the recession in 08-09. So during the 2020 budget year, we saw federal politicians ran up a $328 billion deficit. Now, during that time, the central bank created new money to buy about $275 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds. Now, on April 19th, 2021, we had Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announce that the projected deficit of 2021 would be about $155 billion that year, or about $3 billion deficit per week. By a remarkable coincidence, only 2 days later, the Bank of Canada announced that it would be buying $3 billion worth of government bonds every single week. Yes, I know what you're thinking, remarkable coincidence. But look, that really seems that the printing press is being used to fund Ottawa's deficit spending, regardless of where they're buying the government bonds from, or whether they're buying old or new government debt.
This is getting a bit into the weeds here, but the bank claims it didn't buy government bonds directly from government, that it only bought existing bonds on the open market. Yet the bank's assets grew across a number of categories. So did the bank directly finance the government's spending in a different way other than buying bonds directly from government, like by buying treasury bills from the government, for example?
Well, the central bank is buying government debt and is increasing the amount of money. And remember, the more money or dollars that the central bank creates, the less that your dollars in your bank account or your savings account will buy. That is the inflation tax, and Canadians are suffering from it today. Now, absolutely, the central bank is lowering borrowing costs for the Government of Canada, and the central bank, the Bank of Canada, is buying government debt. Whether it's old debt or it's new debt, they're buying Government of Canada bonds. And just because they are buying Government of Canada bonds from a middleman, it doesn't mean that they're not creating new dollars to buy government debt. Also, another important thing to remember is that it's not like the central bank wasn't active in the primary market. Now, I have a quote that I want to read from you. It's from Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, at his committee appearance in 2020. He said, quote, "We also took a series of steps to reduce our purchases of Government of Canada treasury bills in the primary market. At the peak, we were buying as much as 40% of the T-bill auction."
Lastly, the bank says quantitative easing is technically different than money printing. How would you respond to that statement?
The central bank expanded its balance sheet by about $300 billion during the pandemic. Now, how did it get the money to buy all of those assets? Did it have a bake sale? No, it created new money with the click of a keypad. And look, the Bank of Canada says it didn't buy bonds with cash, but are using settlement balances. Okay, but that's creating new money. Because what are settlement balances? Well, let's quote directly from the Bank of Canada when they say, quote, "Settlement balances or reserves are a unique type of money that the central bank creates," end quote. Oh, by the way, that's from the Bank of Canada's own website on understanding quantitative easing. So Jasmine, what do we make of this Bank of Canada Twitter thread? Well, it seems like the Bank of Canada spinners are working really hard for their next bonus. Because remember, the Bank of Canada during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 were busy handing out $45 million in pay raises and bonuses. Remember, that was during the pandemic while their neighbors in the private sector lost their job, took a pay cut, maybe even lost their business. And it was also in 2021 when CPI was above 3% for 9 consecutive months, and as inflation continued to tick off. So why did the Bank of Canada hand out $45 million in bonuses and pay raises? Well, that's a really good question, because the Bank of Canada itself admits that it failed to meet its inflation target. In fact, the Bank of Canada only has one job, and that's to keep inflation low and around 2%. But if you've been to a grocery store or a gas station in the last year, you know that the Bank of Canada failed to do its only job. So why would the Bank of Canada be handing out millions and millions and millions of dollars in bonuses and pay raises? So again, what do we make of this whole thread from the Bank of Canada on money printing? It looks like those Bank of Canada spinners are working hard for their next bonus.
So it really sounds here like the Bank of Canada is playing a semantics game. They say they didn't print cash, but here we are in a situation where the money supply has greatly increased since the start of the pandemic. Inflation is approaching 8%, and their target was to keep it at 2%.